evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Farm Advisory Service webinar on Schmallenberg Virus, which has been delivered in conjunction with Farmstrong Scotland. I'm Laura Henderson, and I will be your chair tonight. Since the midge-borne Schmallenberg virus was first diagnosed in 2011 in Germany, there have been various incursions into the UK. But if we fast forward to 2025, SRUC Vet Services have isolated Schmallenberg virus from barren cow screens, abortions in sheep and malformed lambs in the south of Scotland. So it's obviously a very topical subject that we're covering tonight, and especially when the current livestock trade is flying, the loss of any livestock can have a devastating financial impact on a business, but we mustn't forget the mental toll on these losses on members of the business. So our three excellent speakers tonight are Colin Mason, Veterinary Investigation Officer and Veterinary Service Manager for SRUC Veterinary Services in Dumfries, who will cover an overview of the Schmallenberg virus. Alix Ritchie from Farmstrong Scotland, who will give us an insight into the work of Farmstrong Scotland and how we can look after ourselves during that busy lambing and calving period. And then our last speaker is Michael Goldie, a farmer from Ayrshire who has unfortunately been affected by Schmallenberg in his flock this year. So he will share his first-hand experiences of Schmallenberg in his pedigree lambing flock at the beginning of this year. So I will hand over to you now, Colin.
Perfect, excellent. Right, my job this evening is just to start off by talking you through some of the biology and some of the clinical signs of Schmallenberg that we've been seeing by way of introduction, really. I don't have all the answers with this one, but we do, and we have learned a fair bit of it over the last 10, 15 years that we've been seeing it. And I'm really just reporting on the work of not just myself, but my colleagues within SRUC Vet Services in Scotland, and also veterinary practitioners, and also farmers who've been affected by this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the virus is, what it does, what the risks are, what the clinical signs are, and how we've learned things and what's happening in Scotland this year. So to start off with, what is it? What is Schmallenberg virus, and what is it, and where does it come from? The picture on the right here is actually the town in Germany called Schmallenberg, where the first cases were identified, and it was named after that, 2011, 2012. It's a vector-borne virus, and that makes it, in my book, pretty unpredictable. It doesn't behave like some of the other viruses that we might recognize in farmed livestock, where it spreads from one animal to another animal and can spread quite quickly. It has to spread through, in this case, midges, which means that we're relying on another living being to be part of the transmission, and that makes it more complicated in terms of how it behaves and how it works. So midges, I'll come on to them in a second. It's spread by one particular type of midge, and given how midgy we are in Scotland, I'll make some comments about that in a tick. This virus emerged in Europe in 2011, so it's been around for a wee while now. And probably, although we're not really sure, it maybe did originally emerge from Central or Northern Africa, where it might well have been endemic but not really fully recognized. So it's something that's probably come into the UK via Europe from the African continent somewhere, we think. In Northern Europe, it recycles pretty much every year. And actually, interestingly enough, in the UK, we are actually on the edge of the sort of zone in the world where we think it might be transmitted. And obviously, the further up we are in the UK and Scotland, maybe perhaps even further to that edge. But that's not to say that it doesn't have its effects in our country. And it seems to go in cycles, so that what we see is that we've seen little flare-ups of disease, 2012, 2013, then again in 2017, and then again now, where it seems to sort of go in waves, and that's how we think it behaves. So just coming back to the midges for a second, I am no midge expert, that's the first thing to say, but we have learned a few things, and there are colleagues out there that specialize in vector-borne disease and midges, and they build a career out of looking at how these particular beasties affect how these viruses spread. And one maybe thing to maybe take note of is that there's two main types of midges in Scotland. There's obsoletus and impunctatus, and probably the midges that we get annoyed with on the west coast of Scotland are more likely to be the impunctatus midge than the obsoletus midge, which is actually good news, believe it or not, because these impunctatus midges can produce eggs without taking a blood meal, and it's that blood meal that these midges take that picks up the virus from an animal, and then as they bite another animal, they spread that virus on, and that's how we think it spreads. So not all Scottish midges will spread it, I think, is one of the take-home messages, which is perhaps good news. What happens when it spreads into herds or flocks? Then there is a vast different level of exposure, and some of the survey work that was done in the teens of the 20th century or 21st century showed that you would get levels of exposure from quite low levels within a herd or a flock to very, very high levels within a herd or flock, and maybe Michael's story will bring out some of that a little bit later on. We're currently in the vector low period at the moment, which is where the temperature is consistently below 12 degrees C, although certainly last weekend it would have been warmer than that, and that seems to be the critical temperature for replication of the virus. That the midges will survive at lower temperatures within sheds. We do recognise and understand that within sheds there probably are microclimates of warmer areas where midges will survive. And interestingly enough, when we reviewed some of our cases that we saw in 2012 and 2013, then what those cases and the timings of those cases showed is that there would have definitely been spread of the virus through midges, certainly right the way through to the end of October that year, and perhaps as late as December that year for that to have occurred. So although the majority of the transmission probably occurs at the peak mid-season, late summer, early autumn, there could potentially be midge transmission that occurs through the autumn and perhaps into the early winter as well. So there's some good news and some bad news there in terms of the types of midge that spread it, and also when that might occur as far as the sort of Scottish calving and lambing flocks is concerned. So what does it do to animals? Some of these signs may not be noted and notable. Depends on the animal system that you've got, but the initial clinical signs that you would get, and these would have occurred in herds and flocks last autumn. They won't be occurring now because it's too cold, but these would have been occurring last autumn, would be classic viral infection, really. Increased body temperatures, off your food. If you're a milking cow, your milk production will drop. You maybe have diarrhea, and then this is a transient infection that will disappear after a few days. So if you're a sheep extensively managed outside, this may go completely unnoticed. If you're a suckler cow on a hill, again, this may go completely unnoticed. If you're a high producing dairy cow milked by a robot, then this will be quite evident to you. So it really just depends on what animals you've got and what systems you've got, whether you would notice this initial infection. The next thing that we get are the reproductive effects, which are the things that are more evident. And one of the problems with these overall is that we pick up on these after the event, if you like, as in the infection will have occurred at some point in the autumn of 2024. And we're now starting to see the after effects of that infection as we go through the winter and into the spring. And that's always tricky when you're investigating disease, because you're behind the curve. By definition, you're behind the curve in terms of what you're seeing and when you see it. So first and foremost, if you get that viral infection and that rise in temperature and that slightly sick animal occurring in the early stages of pregnancy, then that pregnancy might be lost. And that certainly may be relevant in some situations in the cattle and sheep flocks, cattle herds and sheep flocks in southwest Scotland in particular this autumn, as you know, could there have been effects on increased barren rates and early embryonic loss? You wouldn't see anything in the cow, she would just lose the embryo. You wouldn't see anything in the sheep. It's going to get picked up at scanning time. And you know, one of the key questions is well, how have suckler herd scans been? How have sheep scans been for spring calving herds and for lambing flocks? And again, there'll be variation. Some flocks will have fared better than others, some flocks less good. Some flocks will have had really good scans, some less good. The general impression this year from some of the scans, speaking to scanners and farmers, and this is a generalization, is the general feeling is lambing percentages are back, but this isn't necessarily always because of higher barren rates. It might be with ewes having one less lamb than they perhaps would have done in the previous year. But that's very much a generalization. And as I said at the start, this virus is unpredictable. So there will be quite considerable differences between different flocks, different herds, neighboring farms, etc., etc. So we can get abortion and stillbirth as well. But some of the main challenges we've got are what we call these teratogenic effects of the virus. And these are causing deformed lambs or deformed calves to be born now, essentially, through the spring and through really from the start of the year onwards. And this is where it becomes really quite problematic and really quite evident as to what's going on. Again, some work's been done looking at the levels of seroconversion. What I mean by that is the number of cattle or sheep that have been exposed relative to the number of abortions that have occurred. And the thinking is that somewhere along the lines, it's probably a ratio of about 10 to 1, where for every 10 animals that are exposed, then maybe one would actually give birth to a deformed animal. But again, those are just generalizations as well. And also that, studies done in the 10 years or so ago would suggest that for the vast majority of herds or flocks, particularly herds in this case, the number of deformed calves that were born, thankfully, was fairly low. So there's maybe some things to take from that, which are good news. But again, there is considerable herd to herd and flock to flock variation. And Michael's story will allude to that in a wee tick. So reproductive effects. Just coming back to the cattle infertility story. So certainly what we've been picking up on since really probably November, December time is reports from farmers that have had their scan done. This will be cattle herds at this point, had disappointing results, higher barren rates. And probably the first heads up that we had that Schmallenberg was really, really active in Scotland last autumn was the fact that when we did blood samples from these cases, there was high levels of antibodies to Schmallenberg there. And when we've looked at these barren cow screens in previous years, the levels of antibody to Schmallenberg has been particularly low. And most of the animals that are blood sampled would have been antibody negative and not exposed to Schmallenberg. So we think there's definitely a change this year in that Schmallenberg has been active. And a lot of these animals that have been barren have at the very least been exposed to Schmallenberg. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean absolutely cause and effect. As I said before, we're kind of behind the curve in that whatever happened, it would have happened in the autumn, and we're picking up at this in the early winter or even later than that. So we can't absolutely prove cause and effect, but without doubt there's an association there. But one thing that I think is always important to remember is we can't lose sight of all the other causes of particularly high barren rates, either in sheep flocks or cattle herds, in that these other reasons, like, for example, bull fertility issues, other infectious diseases, nutrition in the dams, etc. These things haven't gone away. It's just that this year, unfortunately, we've perhaps got Schmallenberg on top of that as well. So there is, I think, a link and association between barren rates in flocks and herds this year and exposed to Schmallenberg, but it's not absolutely guaranteed rock solid link in every case. What we see with Schmallenberg is a whole range of deformed lambs and calves being born, and the picture on the right that you can see a whole range of different brains removed from cases. This is not my picture, it comes from Rachel Tarlington, one of the vets from Nottingham Vet School, who's also got a big interest in Schmallenberg, and it just shows you what you can get when this virus attacks the nervous tissue of the brain and can cause all sorts of different deformities to the brain, from the biggest one at the top, a normal brain, right the way through to small brains, fluid-filled brains, and a lack of nervous tissue there. Interestingly enough, what we're finding this year is that some of these lambs and calves can be born alive and technically viable with really, really deformed and damaged brains. They don't go on to thrive, but they can be born alive, show nervous signs, and be pretty dopey in terms of how they're behaving. So it has a big effect on central nervous tissue. So you can see these are all cases that we've had through our centre in Dumfries, or pictures that we've taken myself and my colleagues, and little tiny brains, no cerebellum present in the brain there, and also deformities of the vertebral column and the spinal cord as well. So you can see this deformed spine here, which is one of the other sort of clinical signs that we do see with some lambs and some calves that come out that are Schmallenberg affected. But one of the main things that we see, which is pretty characteristic for it, is these bent, fused legs and joints. And when you try to manipulate the leg there, you would not be able to straighten that leg out. It's fixed in place. And why that happens is actually a lack of movement of the fetus during its development inside its mum. And that's because the brain tissue is affected. So basically the nerve supply to the muscles is compromised, either through brain or through the actual nerves themselves. It means that those muscles supplying the legs don't work as much. The lamb doesn't move around as much. And literally what happens in the uterus is that those joints become fixed. And obviously that then leads to lambing problems, to calving problems. Sometimes it's possible to lamb these. Sometimes it's much more difficult to lamb or calve these. So that's one of the challenges that unfortunately we're facing now in terms of how you actually get these things out of the mums without any too much damage. So those are the sorts of pathology that we see. Course of infection, I've slightly alluded to this in the what we think is happening is if you have a naive animal infected for the virus for the first time, it'll be viremic for a short period of time, and in a pregnant animal that virus will get across the placenta and it will get into the fetus, and it's a critical window of time of fetal development where those deformities will occur. So it's quite a narrow window of time in sheep. You think between days 20 and days 50 of pregnancy is when the deformities will occur in lambs, or are set up in lambs. So it's quite a specific 30-day window, month 2 essentially of the pregnancy. So obviously you can see from that it depends when that month actually is relative to the mid-transmission season. In cattle, the window is wider. The pregnancy is obviously longer. So we think somewhere between days 60 and days 180 in cattle is the window of pregnancy, where if they're exposed to the virus, the mothers are exposed to the virus at that stage, the virus gets across the placenta and it can cause damage and give you these deformities that I've just outlined. So in a sense, cattle are running around about 3 months later than sheep in terms of when we're going to see signs. So it's hard to know and predict at the moment what's going to happen, but the prediction would be is that into April, March, April is when we're going to start to see more problems in cattle. Obviously as well, problems can be exacerbated in synchronized herds and flocks, because all we're really doing with a compact calving or a compact lambing, which is very advantageous for a whole load of other reasons in terms of management. But one of the challenges with that is that you've got a lot of animals at exactly the same stage of pregnancy that if they're then exposed to the virus, there can be more and more way of a challenge. And you can see from the graph on the right, basically this is the start of mating, and this was a slide covering, I suppose, the whole of the sheep breeding season, both in England as well as Scotland, with some very, very early lambing flocks in England. But this was looking at SBV confirmed cases, suspected cases, and not suspected cases by the start of the mating period. So the peak time will be July, August, and September and October. So those when the main window, I guess, particularly August, I guess, for the Scottish early lambing flocks is where the biggest challenge might well come. And that risk will diminish the further you get into the lambing period. So I guess if there's a good news story for the bulk of the Scottish lambing that's going to occur March, April, where we are now, the risk is not zero, but the risk will be reducing as time goes on, one would hope. However, it's probably too early to call it as far as the calving is concerned. So What have we seen in Scotland, and what have we seen in the UK? Back in 2020, or it'll be 3, it was mainly in the southeast of England. It then moved into the west of England, and now it's moved further into Scotland through the autumn of 2024. And we're now seeing the effects of that in 2025. And as I've already alluded to, we've seen a lot of antibody positive animals come up through testing right the way around Scotland. What we've seen by way of problems and issues so far through our surveillance system and through our disease surveillance centres so far. So we saw our first cases of deformed lambs in early lambing flocks on the 3rd of January. And that was a couple of flocks where we saw deformed lambs born. We think the infection window for that was probably somewhere between the 26th of August and the 25th of September. So bang on what we were saying. Since then, we've confirmed diagnoses on 18 holdings, and I'll come back to that in a second. 16 sheep, 2 cattle, probably too early to call cattle at the moment. And these are the areas where we've seen them. So essentially South Scotland, with the furthest north cases so far in Perthshire, but mainly in the southern half of Scotland, which is probably to be expected. Most of the cases have been small numbers affected in an individual flock. And there've really been 2 notable exceptions to that. And Michael will talk about that a little bit more later on. But for the majority of the ones that we've seen, thankfully, the numbers in the actual flock have been fairly low. And I come back again to the sort of unpredictability of this virus, in that it's hard to call how they get exposed and how many will be infected. Obviously, those numbers, that's 18 holdings. That's based on our passive surveillance system in Scotland. There will be far more farms that have had affected lambs than that. I'm in absolutely no doubt. So there will inevitably be underreporting. Some farmers will see this and recognise this. Some farmers will talk to their practice vet about it and recognise that they've got some of these clinical signs and not necessarily go for further investigation. So there's always that question of what are we not seeing? One of the things that did happen a couple of weeks ago, one of my colleagues, Helen Carty, they organised a meeting of Ayrshire vets to talk about Schmallenberg, and it was quite interesting. There was every vet practice in Ayrshire was represented at that meeting in Ayr a few weeks ago. We were just talking about some of the issues I've just raised here. And the general feeling amongst the vets in the room that night, admittedly that was late February and not into March, is that yes, they had seen cases, but there were also plenty of flocks and herds that so far had lambed and calved fine. And again, that just feeds into that sort of mixed pattern of what we're seeing, in that, you know, some herds and flocks could be quite significantly affected, others less so. Just a couple of final things to finish on. Schmallenberg takes all the headlines at the moment, and quite rightly so, and I don't want to diminish that in any way, shape or form, but also all the other causes of abortion haven't disappeared, unfortunately. And I think also one of the real challenges, first 2 to 3 weeks of March is when we see through our centres the biggest number of sheep abortions coming through in Scottish flocks, as we just run into the main peak of lambing end of March, beginning of April. And it's always very, very stressful knowing, you know, you're getting late pregnant ewes aborting, you're getting no live lambs born, you're perhaps getting some deformed lambs born. And it's always really hard to know, what is this the start of? Is this something that's going to settle down? Or is this something that's going to go on and develop and continue to be bad? And, you know, how do you handle that? And it is, I acknowledge entirely, really a horrible situation to be in, and pretty stressful in those very early stages. And I guess you all breathe a sigh of relief when you start to get some live lambs born and some normal, healthy lambs born as well. But one thing I would always share and advise is, you know, if you are getting problems, is reach out to your vet and reach out to ourselves to try and get them investigated, so we can work out what is going on. A problem shared is a problem halved. To some degree, and there are some causes of abortion that you can do things about. So the picture in the middle here is a case of enzootic abortion in sheep, and there are things that you can do about that right now if you have a diagnosis. Admittedly, there are other causes of abortion like toxoplasmosis here, or indeed Schmallenberg here, where there is nothing that you can actually do at this stage apart from ride it out. But at least if you're looking for other reasons, you're trying your best to do as much as you can to investigate and also to plan for what you do next year. And in particularly just on Schmallenberg, actually sampling to see if Schmallenberg virus is involved is really, really easy, because the main samples that we suggest that we take are either a bit of the umbilical cord from a newborn lamb, or indeed a scrape of the fluid that's on the surface of the lamb as it's born, or a calf. And that can be quite rich in Schmallenberg virus if it is actually the case. So it's quite an easy thing to investigate if you want to go down that route. Finally, and I don't want to get too bogged down in this, I just want to mention and make passing mention of blue tongue, because it is also something that is of concern to us in Scotland, and we're at a bit of a tipping point at the moment as to how that's going to go and what decisions are going to be made by policymakers in terms of what we do. But the only reason for raising that right now is the same midges that transmit Schmallenberg transmit blue tongue, and these maps were the state of play really at the end of the main midge transmission season at the end of 2024, with fairly widespread transmission through mainland and northern Europe and into mainly the southeast and east of England. And this was the protection zone that was put in place by APHA in England last year to try and stop the spread further into the UK. And it's a little bit of a waiting game at the moment as to how this goes, both in terms of how it starts to spread and what the policy effects of that are. But that's something that we need to look out for and be very much aware of, as I think certainly on the veterinary side, a lot of thought and attention going into this at the moment. Okay, so I'll finish up there. Oh yeah, one final thing to say. For vets and for farmers, we can share the link of this. There is a lambing survey this year, as there has been run on numerous years, looking at the effects and the impact of Schmallenberg on flocks and herds. So if you are affected by it, and we want to try and feed into a sort of a national network of impact for this, and I don't say this lightly in that, we need to be thinking about what other control measures we can have for this virus going forward. Registering impact is really quite important. So the 2025 UK lambing survey is up and running at the moment, where we can really start to judge the effects of this right across the board.
Thanks, Colin. Lots to think about there, and I'm sure as some of you will be feeling the same as me, just a little bit alarmed by that. But what we want to do next is just talk a little bit about Farmstrong, what we do, and then we're also going to hear from Michael Goldie, who has been through an outbreak, and he can share some of the experiences he had, the impact it had, but also the experiences as well. So we'll get to Michael in a minute, but first I just want to have a quick chat about Farmstrong. Some of you, I'm aware, will be aware of Farmstrong, so I'm just going to whiz through this slide. Really, Farmstrong came from New Zealand. It started out there about 10 years ago, and Doug Avery came to Scotland from New Zealand to talk about resilience and farming after some of the challenges he'd faced. And after some of these events, a few people within Scottish agriculture said, well, how can we make this a legacy? And Doug had said, well, there's something in New Zealand called Farmstrong, and hence Farmstrong Scotland was born. So we officially became a charity last year after launching the Highland Show the year before. We're not one-to-one support. We work with our partners to promote that. I'll talk a little bit about that later. We are really trying to encourage farmers and crofters to improve their well-being and take small positive steps just to kind of build that into your day, your week, your month, so that becomes a good habit. Farmstrong is designed through research. So our foundation research was conducted by SRUC, and we've now got Scotland Farm doing annual monitoring for us. And the real reason behind that is to make sure that what we're delivering is fit for purpose for the farmers and crofters of Scotland, and also that we are reacting to any of the topics that are of real concern or of real interest to the farmers and crofters. One of our core messages, and I may say this several times, and I'm not going to apologise for that because it is really at the heart of what we're doing, is that better well-being equals better business. So we're wanting farmers and crofters to really invest in the number one asset on the farm, which is themselves, because if you've got better well-being, you'll be in a better place to make better business decisions. There's also some research from New Zealand that shows that better well-being also reduces your farm accidents and injuries as well. So it can have wide-ranging impacts of looking after yourself. one of the main things that we do at Farmstrong is to really make sure that what we're putting out is peer-to-peer, and that's why I'm delighted to have Michael here to share his own experience, because I think we know that it really resonates when you hear from other farmers and crofters about what works for them. And one of the ways we do that is through sharing stories. So we have a monthly story in the Scottish Farmer, which we also share online and across our social medias. And the podcast series is another thing that we're doing to really share people's stories. And again, I'll talk a bit about that later. So what we're trying to do is just to make sure that farmers and crofters have got the tools that they can really start to look after themselves and make small positive steps. Okay, so yeah, just really making sure that we can equip farmers and crofters with the skills, tools, and the capacity to live well, to farm and croft well as well. So we all have well-being. This is something that we all have, and you'll all recognise that -5 to +5 scale, because we all move up and down that scale, you know, day to day, week to week. And things like an outbreak on the farm, or it could be a disaster within the family, a breakdown in a relationship. There's lots of different things that can impact this wellness scale. And sometimes it can just be a combination of lots of little things that build up. So I'd say for myself, I probably range between -2 to +3. And again, that can go lower and it can go higher depending what's happening. And what we're trying to do is just encourage people to nudge themselves up that scale by just taking small practical steps. And when we talk about well-being, I think often you hear a lot about physical well-being, keeping fit and healthy and active, and mental well-being. But some of the other things that we're really trying to focus on in Farmstrong is emotional well-being. So our thought process, the voice that we have in our heads, if that's a particularly negative voice, that can have a big impact. And also our social well-being. We know from our research that farming can be isolating, it can be a lonely job. And a lot of the time in the past, farmers would have got together for dipping, clipping, harvest time. But there's just not the same amounts of people on farm. So what we're trying to do is enable different ways that farmers can get together to connect socially as well. And also, I've mentioned both of these before, but just to reiterate that point, that better well-being equals better business, and also a reduction in farm accidents and injuries. I'm going to now hand back over to Michael, and then I'll come back with some practical tools and tips for afterwards. So over to you, Michael.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
I don't have any slides. I've got a few notes that I made. I'm just going to crack straight in. I've done a few things recently, so apologies to those that have seen me already banging on about this, but I just wanted to start by saying I've wanted to raise awareness about this from the get-go, just to give people an understanding of how it might affect them, get them thinking about it, get them prepped for it, and try and give them an opportunity to prepare for it, because when it hit us, it was like a freight train. We just didn't know what to do. And it was a minor disaster. Well, not a minor disaster, it was a major disaster, because we literally just started lambing, and you think you're going to go into the lambing looking forward to a big tup lamb to take to the tup sales, or something to take to the show to win, to breed with. And then all of a sudden you're dealing with a disaster. So in summary, and I'm going to touch quickly on some of the stuff that Colin mentioned. I've done a lot of thinking post, and our results have been catastrophic in relation to what the average has been. I'm not really absolutely sure why. I don't know whether there's a geographical thing where the sheep were, and we've got a neighbouring quarry. I don't know if there's standing water in there that has a breeding ground for more midges than normal. I also know, having now tested the ewes and understanding it a bit better, that a lot of our younger sheep, and the flock was made up of a higher proportion of younger sheep, because I've been pushing hard at growing the flock and expanding the flock. So all our recips were yearlings, or 18-month-old to 36 months old. They weren't that old, and we had a larger proportion of younger sheep in the flock. And all of those animals are the ones that have been really badly affected. And I'm presuming that's why it is, but I don't really know, because I don't think we know enough about the disease yet. So in terms of how it affected us, many people have heard me talk about this, but we had all the classic stuff that Colin was mentioning. We had poor scan results from our recips, particularly, significantly worse than the breeding company were hoping for, or we were hoping for. And on reflection, it was probably Schmallenberg, because we've subsequently tested all the ewes, and a lot of the ewes that aborted early have tested seropositive for Schmallenberg. So that has explained one part of it. And then we appeared to have just suffered from every kind of form of problem that was going, problems with lambings, deformities, brain defects, little or no muscle mass, skeletal problems. It just seemed that I don't know how or why, because it's a midge and you will never probably know, but we appeared to get almost every single thing that was going. During lambing, it was an extremely challenging period, and it was very difficult for myself and my mum. But during it all, we just got through it, and then very quickly we just tried to look for solutions and I've delved into it heavily to try and understand what has caused all these problems and all our losses, and to give me the best chance of considering how we move forward from it, because if we don't move forward, there's no point. So that's where we're at the minute. I noticed the wellness scale, Alex, and I was going to say that -5 to 5, I think we're about -100 during lambing, when I would normally like to be +100 when we've got some nice lambs in the ground, but ultimately, as I've said a few times as well, it's outside the back door. It's not my family, it's not my friends. And I took strength from the fact that we all had our physical well-being, and I've got other people that I know that are quite close to me are not in the same position, and you just try and look forward, and that's basically how we got through it, my mum and I. I'm also very fortunate. My mum's extremely stoic. My mum is one of the toughest cookies that I know, and kept me going, and I think I kept her going. So we worked together to get through it, basically.
Yeah, so you've talked about the support network there, Michael, and you've talked about getting a bit of perspective, or trying to get a bit of perspective about the positives that you've got. What about the actual practical things that you did? You know, how did you manage it sort of day to day, and, you know, just to get up every morning and go back out when you knew that, you know, there was possibly bad things to come?
I don't know. You just keep going. I don't know. We just got up and kept going. It was part of it is that you just want to try and look after your stock and make sure that the ones that might survive can survive. And also, I think I've alluded to this before, having worked with the NFU Mutual for 25 years, there or thereabouts, I've come across many disaster situations, and I probably looked at it like, what's the problem? What do we need to do to get us through the problem? Let's act, let's not mess about. So on the worst day, I said, Mum was really upset, and I said, look, we're going to have to put down a hell of a lot of lambs here, Mum, because they're just not going to make it. And she was like, no, you've got to give them a chance. Where there's life, there's hope. And I said, right, a negotiated settlement. I'll get Alan Walker, our vet from our vet groups, to come, and we'll let Alan make the decision, because then it's a professional person. And Alan came, and we basically cleared out the week. One of the things that I have realised from this is that you just have to be very ruthless and clear out the week. And it did a couple of things. It allowed us to see what we had in front of us in terms of the ones that were going to live, and we could focus on them and be more positive about them, because we get rid of the problem. And it also allowed us some breathing space, because at one point with so many sheep in pens and so many sick animals that, you know, it was 24 hours a day. I had a superb 5th year vet student who'd come to do some work in the farm, and we just stuck at it and just stuck at it. But it was a very challenging time.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing your story, because I know you're really passionate about making sure that, you know, this gets out and people are aware of what to do and what to look for. You obviously work closely with your vets. Have they been part of sort of working with you for a solution for next year? And I just wonder what sort of changes, if any, you're going to be making sort of going forward.
Yeah, poor Alan has been roasted. I've roasted the life out of him, asking questions about various things he gets. So if he does happen to listen tonight, I apologise profusely for the random times of the WhatsApp messages that I send. But I do know that he goes out and feeds his cows at 5:30 to 6 in the morning, so I don't feel too guilty some mornings. But yeah, I've hoovered up as much information as I can to try and work in a strategy for next year and how I survive and how we go forward. One of my biggest concerns is that it's a midge, it's airborne. There doesn't appear to be an absolute certainty that if you've got a ewe that's had it, she'll carry full antibodies for next year. Nobody appears, from people I've spoken to down south, nobody appears to be able to give you that absolute guarantee. So that's quite a thought process. And when Colin put up that graph with the July, August, September, October, that the critical periods, I had a batch of recip ewes that had aborted or weren't in lamb that I put in lamb to a Suffolk tup. And on the 1st of March, I was still getting lambs that were deformed, presumably Schmallenberg, because I know what they look like now. I didn't send them away to get tested because when Alan and I spoke, he said, well, you know, we know the definite results and there's not much point in doing these. You now know that 1st of March, lambing is still potentially a risk for you. And that is a very big challenge for us going forward, because for 60 years, we've been breeding pedigree Suffolks to breed tup lambs to sell August, September, early October. So that in itself is a challenge.
Yeah, a lot to think about. And you've got a bit of time, but I know that, you know, you're wanting to make these decisions quickly because it comes round quickly enough, the tupping for next year. So you talked about the importance of a support network, gaining perspective, solutions based. You've talked about that quite a few times, as that's quite an important part of helping you get through, and then also focusing on the positives that are there. Is there anything else that you would want to share, just while you've got this platform, with those who are probably coming into lambing, maybe feeling a little bit nervous having sat through this webinar? Is there any sort of piece of advice or anything else that you would like to share with them before we finish?
I think just I'm hopeful that the later lambing flocks don't have the same exposure just because of and from what I think, by the sounds of it, we've been hit pretty bad. You know, I have other colleagues, friends who are Suffolk breeders who have suffered fairly significant losses, sort of not far off what I've suffered as well. But I'm hopeful that the tail is not as bad. The only real advice I would give when you get them, although it sounds really brutal, your first loss is your best loss. And you'll never get a sickly lamb to do. My mum made me keep probably 20 lambs, and I think we've hardly got any of them left. We had a spell for about 3 weeks where there was just stuff dying every day or had to be put down because we just couldn't get them to function. So I'm presuming it's because of the small brains, yes, and other symptoms. So the key thing I would say is your first loss is your best loss, and do the difficult thing to clear the decks and focus on the ones that are fit and healthy, because you'll never get them right. They just don't. There is something clinically wrong with them, and they'll never come right. That'd be the only thing I would say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. And also, if you want to hear more about Michael's story, there is a blog available from NFU Scotland, and also Michael's recorded a podcast with Farmstrong Scotland, and I'll share the details for that as well. So thank you very much, Michael. I'll now go back to the PowerPoint and share a few practical resources. And Michael will be available. If you've got any questions for Michael, you can add them to the Q&A section. So one of the tools that we talk about in Farmstrong, and it's kind of one of our foundation tools, is the 5 ways to wellbeing. So this isn't something that we've come up with at Farmstrong. This is international research has found that people who thrive do these 5 things in common, and they are connect, keep learning, give, take notice, and be active. Now, I know we're coming into a really busy spell, and there are certain things within this that you may not have time to do, but I just want to highlight that if you can start thinking about what this might look like for you, because it's different for all of us, and try and build some of that time, or plan to do some of these things after lambing, if that's what's coming up around the corner, or calving. So the first of these is connect, and this is something that we can do, and Michael talked about very eloquently about connecting with others, having that support network, whether it's within your family or out with, and that can be talking on the phone, that can be a WhatsApp group, it can be Snapchat, whatever works for you, and or popping in and seeing a neighbour. If you're passing a fence line and you've got a neighbour that's also lambing, just stopping and having a chat for 5 minutes. That connecting with other people, and as Michael said, talking about it can really help. So, and often you'll find when you share stories with others, you know, that several people have been in the same boat. So that connection piece is really, really important. The second one is keep learning. And one of the ways that we've found has been really popular within farming and crofting since we've started with Farmstrong is podcasts. So we're farm as well up in Ayrshire, and both my husband and I, when we're out farming at lambing time and throughout the year, we have our headphones in and we're listening to podcasts, and that can be something to do with farming, something humorous, something political. It can really range. So that is a great way to learn. I've got some podcast episodes that I can share with you as well. That give piece, I mean, that you can help out in various different ways within agriculture or out with. So it could be helping with coaching a sports team, a kids sports team, or it could be with RETs, or helping with RSABI, or some of the other great charities that exist within agriculture. And as well as helping that organisation or that group, it actually helps you as well. So that's one of the other ways of well-being. The fourth is something that we can all do, even at the busiest times, and that is take notice. And I think just kind of picking up on what Michael said, when we're lambing or calving, just taking a pause, looking at the stock that you've got, you know, the ones that you're really excited about, whether it's a cracking pair of lambs or a really nice heifer that you've seen, or just taking a pause, or it might be the scenery. You know, we all live in beautiful farms, and just taking that moment, turning the quad bike off, and it could be for 2 minutes, sitting listening to the birds and really thinking about some of the positives for the day. That can actually change the way our brains work. So really taking that pause to take notice can be really impactful. And that's something that we can do even at the busiest of times. And then the last one is be active. Now, in the middle of lambing, you may not be feeling like going for a run, but I think just throughout the year, it's good to just try and remember that raising the heart rate, and it could be a brisk walk for 10 minutes, set a timer goes off, turn around and walk back. And that 20-minute brisk walk can be enough a couple of times a week just to really increase your activity. So they're just some of the 5 ways of well-being. And again, how you interpret that could be different to how I do it. So it's just worth taking a moment just to think about that and how that's going to work for you. As I've mentioned, we've got our podcast series. So we've got interviews. You can see all the names there, of which Michael is one, Michael Goldie is one. We've also got Michael Blanche, who does a great episode about time. Cora Cooper, who's another sheep farmer, and she's talking about just that whole taking notice and what she's doing on her farm to look after herself as well. They're available on our website, but they're also available on Spotify and all the other places that you can get your podcasts as well. If you just search Farmstrong Scotland, they should pop up. One of the other things that we started last year, which has been very popular, is our Farmstrong Spotify playlist. And this really took off at lambing time last year, and it's just a bit of fun. So you can add your own songs. There's a great mix, maybe not all great, but there's definitely a mix of songs on there. And as I said, you can send in your suggestions for that and we can get them added on. We've also got a podcast playlist if you're looking for some inspiration as well. As well as this, if you go onto our Farmstrong website, there's also some videos, there's some other resources on stress, there's sleep resources coming on later on in the week, and we're always adding to that. So you can sign up to our newsletter and you'll get a reminder of all the different resources that we've got coming up. I'm not going to go into all of them today, but they are available on our website if you need them. As I mentioned, we, Farmstrong, don't provide one-to-one support. We're very much about the early intervention, preventative work that people can do to improve their own well-being. But if you are concerned about yourself or someone else, it's really important that you talk to somebody. And that can be the Samaritans, it can be our friends at RSABI, of which they've got a 24-hour helpline. And they've also got support in various other ways that you can see in the wheel there. There's also breathing space and also your NHS doctor. And for those in the young farmers, the Are You OK website has some great resources as well. So just before we go to the question session, I just want to finish with this. We are the most important asset on the farm is the people. We really need to look after ourselves. And Jock Gibson, who is a farmer, butcher, and one of our trustees, the quote there, I'm not going to read it out, but you can see the real focus is about the most important asset is ourselves. And if we can all just take a wee moment to think about how we're looking after our sheep, which Michael's talking about, or our cattle, we're looking after our land, our machinery, our soil, and just trying to invest in ourselves a little bit as well. And hopefully that will make a big difference to all of you. So thank you for inviting me along. And I'm going to hand you back to the SAC team for questions.
Thank you very much there to all our speakers. That's been a really great whistle-stop tour around Schmallenberg. And it's great, Michael, that you were so open and honest there about your story and really useful resources that you've highlighted there, Alex, that we can send round with the recording for this for anyone that's interested. So we'll just move on to questions. We've had quite a few coming in. So I think first one will go to you for Colin. So it's touching on what Michael said at the end there, that he's had quite a lot of his flock affected. How long does that immunity last? Does this mean that because Michael's had such a bad year this year that lambing 2026 will be a little bit better for him? Or does he need to think about changing his tupping dates, because he has mentioned there that right through his lambing period he has had cases?
Yeah, and we don't have all the answers to this, but we've got a few pointers perhaps, and maybe just the point that Michael made, that he was still getting some lambs born this month with obvious Schmallenberg signs. You know, it does suggest that it was still active in the flock at that stage, and therefore would have been active later into the autumn in that flock. I guess with that, there was obviously just a pool of infected ewes that just kept the whole cycle going. Midges were still active, they bit and spread it on. So it just does show you in individual circumstances how it can, you know, continue and be different from farm to farm. The general consensus is that once you're infected, simple viral disease in this sense, in that you then become immune, you have antibodies, and they stay around for years. And that's well recognized that they stay around for 3-4 years. And the initial thinking, I mentioned the fact that you get these cycles with it, so that you get nationally at least, you get a bad year, and then you have 3-4 good years, and then you get another bad year. And the thinking, particularly around the sheep flock, is that coincides with the sort of profile of your average sheep flock, in that you get a quite high degree of infection. You then have a lot of immune sheep. Those immune sheep are then present in your flock for a long period of time. As those sheep die out and are replaced by younger non-immune sheep, then, you know, the risk perhaps goes on to steadily increase over time. So the general wisdom is that the immunity after an infectious year is long lasting and should be protective. But there is always, you know, some flock to flock variation in that. There's for everything I say, there'll be another flock that sort of counters that, if you know what I mean. In that there are some flocks that have been hit in 2 years, but perhaps in the second year not as badly. I never mentioned it in my talk, but one thing, the reason I didn't mention it is it's currently not available. But, you know, when Schmallenberg first came along, we had a vaccine. The pharmaceutical industry really responded super quick and got a vaccine produced. Unfortunately, that's no longer available. And the challenge with that, as far as the farming industry is concerned, is it was just supply and demand, and there wasn't much demand for that vaccine, and you know, probably was a major financial loss for the pharmaceutical companies that made it. So, you know, one of the thoughts going forward is, as this becomes more of an endemic disease, you know, there might be more of a justification to go back to these pharmaceutical companies and think, well, should we have more vaccine available? But currently, I don't want to get people's hopes up with that, because there isn't a vaccine available. As to changing topping dates, it can help, but so much of those topping dates is fixed around the sheep calendar and the sheep year, so it's hard to do that, isn't it? But I think going forward, trying to be positive, the hope is that there's a much higher degree of immunity in Michael's flock, if we take that as an example, now than what there was 12 months ago, that should hopefully stand it in better stead going forward.
Yeah, great there. And, you know, coming back to control of these, you know, you mentioned there that the lack of the vaccine. Is there anything else practical that we can do, such as dipping ewes pre-tupping to control the midges, or pasture management to try and minimise contact with those midges?
It's really difficult, this one, and it's been thought about in the Schmallenberg context, it's been thought about in the blue tongue context as well. And the trouble with it is it just takes one midge to bite. So one midge that's carrying the virus then bites a sheep or bites a cow, that is transmission successfully achieved as far as the virus is concerned. So it's incredibly successful at transmitting that way. So anything that we do with, you know, insecticide products or repellent products, the actual impact at a flock level is quite limited, unfortunately. I wish I had better news on this than I can give you, but you know, you could reduce the number of midges by you know, going to certain areas or you know, applying products to animals, but you'll never reduce that to zero, and therefore, because it only just takes a single midge to bite, then that is one of the challenges. So you can't completely, you know, get away from it.
Yeah, and you've kind of touched there on some of the similarities and differences there with Schmallenberg and blue tongue virus. So Schmallenberg is not a notifiable disease in the UK. Blue tongue is notifiable.
Yes.
And part of the government's control measures for blue tongue, certainly in England, was to create some restriction movement zones. Would there be any risk of that being applied for Schmallenberg virus, and what impact is there on trade, especially for the likes of exporting semen and embryos in terms of Schmallenberg virus?
Okay, so yeah, you're right. Schmallenberg's not notifiable, blue tongue is, so there's going to be no, you know, national restrictions on movement as far as that is concerned. Within the UK, as far as Schmallenberg is concerned, blue tongue, it's too early to call really at the moment. That's going to be an evolving situation in the next, you know, coming weeks and months. So that's the first thing. As far as international trade is concerned, then that depends very much on country to country, you know. So take as an example, United States, Canada, they don't have Schmallenberg, Europe does. So because there is theoretical risk of transmission through, for example, semen, they're going to impose restrictions, you know, on a sort of country by country basis on the sale of these products, or indeed the testing that needs to be done for those animals for that product to be sold. So it's not like a complete ban, but it will impact trade and it will require testing. So that's very much a country to country specific thing, and you know, it's any individual country's right to put whatever requirements they want to protect animal health. And you can see it from, you know, if you don't have this virus in your country and you're in a different continent, you don't want to get it. So I can see it from that perspective. The only other comment that I would make, and again, this is a really difficult one, and blue tongue might trump this actually, is, you know, to some degree, a closed flock policy can help, because it will stop the movement of infected animals, but it doesn't stop the movement of infected midges, and that's one of the challenges here. So midges can travel across land. They actually don't travel quite so far over land compared to what they do over water, but they can travel, and you know, therefore there are going to be these regional differences. One of the things I think is also worth saying, just talking to farmers that have come in with cases to us in Dumfries, there's some quite almost bizarre examples really, whereby flock kept on one holding absolutely completely fine. They've got some sheep away 2 miles down the road that have been quite severely impacted. So there is an awful lot of very, very regional differences, almost sort of neighbourly differences. So it's that unpredictability of how these midges transmit this disease, which is hard to really work out.
Yeah, and just touching on that as well, is within some of these multiple litters where we have twins or triplets, is it possible for just one of those lambs to be affected and the rest to be normal with Schmallenberg?
Yes. And we've certainly seen that reported. Yes, I looked at a lamb last week that I don't think we've got a final diagnosis for it yet, but it almost certainly will be Schmallenberg, and it was one of a litter of it was one of a set of triplets, and the other two were fine. And I don't really understand that, to be honest. It must be something to do with how the placenta forms, etc., and how the blood supply to those fetuses work. I mean, we see it also with other causes of abortion, like toxoplasmosis. You get one dead mummified lamb, and then you get another perfectly fine lamb, and they've both been in the same uterus together. So some of these things, maybe smarter people than me could really work that out. But it certainly seems possible, looking at what we're seeing, that you can get a live lamb that's perfectly normal alongside a dead deformed, or a certainly deformed lamb, although it's kind of hard to fathom out how that will happen.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably make this our last question of tonight, because we're now running a wee bit over time, but it's one for you, Michael. So you've obviously been through an incredibly tough time this year, and you demonstrated very strong resilience. But what did you recognise in Alix's wellbeing advice that helped you get through this spring?
Pretty much all 5 things that she put up in her bubble: health, well-being, support, structure. I can't remember what they were. A bit of everything, really. I'm not being dismissive of the question. That is all little bits of everything.
Yeah, that's it. It's not one thing. It's a combination of everything together.
Yeah, just a combination of everything. And I was fortunate, and I am fortunate, that I have elements of all of those to pull upon. Thank
you very much then, everyone, for tonight. So I think it's quite clear that Schmallenberg is going to be a big challenge this spring. If anyone has any cases, you're best to investigate them, because as Colin says, the first case could be the first of an outbreak. But if you are struggling at any point, do use some of that resources that Alix has kindly highlighted to us all, and we'll send this out on the recording. But thank you and good night.